There's a moment in gardening that can feel a little confusing. Your plant isn't dying, the leaves are still there, nothing looks obviously wrong. But at the same time, it's not really growing either. No new leaves, no real progress, just staying the same week after week. And if you've ever been in that situation, you've probably asked yourself, what am I missing here? Because from your perspective, you're doing everything right. You're watering, you're checking the soil. Maybe you've even tried feeding it a little more. And still, nothing changes. This is one of those quiet frustrations in gardening that doesn't get talked about enough. It's not dramatic. It doesn't look like a problem at first. But over time, it can make you doubt your instincts and even enjoy your garden a little less. In this video, I want to walk through what's really happening in that situation. Not just what to do, but why this happens in the first place. Because in many home gardens, plants don't fail all at once. They slowly stop moving forward. And once you start to see that pattern, it changes how you care for almost everything in your garden. When we say a plant isn't growing, it's easy to assume something is wrong in a very obvious way. But in many cases, that's not what's happening at all. The plant is still alive. It's still maintaining its leaves. It may even look reasonably healthy from a distance. But underneath that appearance, something important is missing: growth. And growth in a home garden doesn't always mean fast or dramatic changes. It can be small, a slightly larger leaf, a new shoot that wasn't there last week, a root system slowly expanding below the surface. When those small signs stop showing up, that's when a plant begins to shift into a different state. Not failing, but not moving forward either. From my experience, this is where many gardeners get stuck. Because everything looks okay, so we assume everything is okay. But there's a quiet difference between a plant that is surviving and a plant that is actually growing. And that difference is not always easy to see at first. In many home gardens, plants can stay in this in-between state for a long time. Weeks, sometimes even months. They're not asking for help in obvious ways, but they're also not building anything new. And if we don't recognize that state early, we often respond in ways that make things just a little worse. Sometimes by doing more, sometimes by changing too much too quickly. So before we talk about what to fix, it helps to understand this one idea clearly. A plant can look fine and still not be in a position to grow. And once you see that difference, a lot of small decisions in the garden start to make more sense. One of the most helpful shifts you can make in gardening is learning to see the difference between a plant that is surviving and one that is actually growing. Because those two states can look surprisingly similar, especially at first. A plant in survival mode will often hold on to what it already has. The leaves stay green, nothing collapses. From the outside, it looks stable, but inside, the plant is being careful. It's not building new leaves, it's not expanding its roots very much. It's simply maintaining what it already has. And in many home gardens, this happens more often than we realize, especially when conditions are almost right, but not quite enough to support real growth. Maybe the light is just a bit too low. Maybe the soil holds water a little too long. Maybe the roots don't have quite enough space or air. None of these are extreme problems, but together, they quietly limit what the plant can do. So instead of growing, the plant makes a small adjustment. It slows down, it conserves energy, it waits. From my experience, this is where many gardeners misread the situation. Because nothing looks urgent, we assume nothing needs to change. Or sometimes we try to push the plant forward by adding more water, more fertilizer, more attention. But a plant in survival mode doesn't need more input. It needs better conditions, and often more stability. Once the environment supports growth, the plant usually responds on its own. Not instantly, not dramatically, but steadily and in a way that feels natural. So the goal isn't to force growth, it's to create the conditions where growth can happen again. One of the most frustrating parts of this situation is the feeling that you're doing everything right. You're paying attention, you're showing up, You're trying to care for your plants the best you can. And yet, nothing seems to move forward. From my experience, this is where gardening becomes less about effort and more about alignment. Because doing the right things at the wrong time or in slightly off conditions can still lead to very slow results. You might be watering consistently, but the soil never quite dries enough between watering. You might be feeding your plants, but the roots aren't in a condition to use those nutrients effectively. You might be placing your plants in light, but not quite the kind of light that encourages new growth. None of these actions are wrong on their own. That's what makes this so difficult to notice. It's not a clear mistake. It's a series of small mismatches. And over time, those small mismatches add up until the plant settles into that familiar in-between state. Still alive, still stable, but not really going anywhere. In many home gardens, this happens quietly. There's no moment where things suddenly go wrong. Just a slow drift away from conditions that support growth. And because everything feels reasonable, we rarely stop to question the pattern. We just keep doing more of the same. Or we try to fix it by adding something new without really understanding what's already happening. This is where a small shift in thinking can make a big difference. Instead of asking, "Am I doing the right things?" it can be more helpful to ask, "Are these conditions actually helping the plant grow?" Because sometimes the issue isn't effort, it's direction. There's a point in gardening where care quietly turns into pressure. Not because you're doing anything wrong on purpose, but because you're trying a little too often. From my experience, this is one of the most common patterns behind slow or stalled growth. We see that nothing is changing, and our instinct is to do something. Water a bit more, check the soil again, adjust the position, maybe add a little fertilizer, just in case. Each action on its own feels reasonable, but when they happen too close together, the plant never really gets a chance to settle. Roots especially need stability. They need time to adjust to moisture levels, time to explore the soil, time to rebuild after even small disruptions. And when that environment keeps shifting, even in small ways, the plant stays in a kind of low-level stress. Not enough to show damage, but enough to slow everything down. You might not see yellow leaves, you might not see wilting, but you also won't see strong, steady growth, because the plant is constantly adjusting instead of moving forward. In many home gardens, overcare doesn't look like a mistake. It looks like dedication. It looks like attention. It even feels like you're being responsible. But plants don't always respond best to constant input. They often respond better to consistency, to rhythm, to having time between actions. This is something that took me a while to understand. Because doing less can feel like you're neglecting the plant. But in reality, you may be giving it exactly what it needs. A little more space, a little more time, and a little less interference. Sometimes, helping a plant grow starts with learning when to step back. One of the most misleading parts of gardening is how often soil looks perfectly fine on the surface. It doesn't seem too wet, it doesn't seem too dry. There's no obvious smell. Everything appears normal. But soil is one of those things where what you see on top is not always what's happening underneath. From my experience, many plants that stop growing aren't struggling above the soil, they're struggling below it. And often it comes down to something very subtle. The soil is holding just a little too much water, or not allowing enough air to reach the roots. Not enough to cause rot right away, but enough to slow everything down. Roots don't just need water, they also need oxygen. And when soil stays consistently heavy, even if it doesn't look soaked, those air pockets begin to disappear. At that point, the roots don't fail, they just stop expanding. They become cautious, they limit their activity. And that change, even though it's invisible, affects everything above the soil. Leaves may still look fine, the plant may still hold its shape, but new growth becomes slower and sometimes barely noticeable. In many home gardens, this kind of soil issue goes unnoticed because we tend to judge soil by how it looks on the surface or how it feels in a quick check. But a better question might be, how long does this soil stay wet after watering? Not just today, but 2 days later, 3 days later. If the soil stays cool, heavy, and damp for too long, that's often a sign that roots aren't getting what they need. And over time, that quiet imbalance can keep a plant in that same in-between state. So sometimes, the issue isn't what you're adding to the soil, it's how the soil is holding and releasing what's already there. One of the hardest parts of understanding plant health is that some of the most important changes happen where we can't see them, below the soil. And when it comes to slow or stalled growth, root stress is often part of the story, even if everything above the soil looks fine. Roots are constantly responding to their environment, moisture levels, air availability, soil structure. All of these shape how roots grow or don't grow. But unlike leaves, roots don't give us clear visual signals right away. They don't turn yellow overnight. They don't wilt in obvious ways. Instead, they quietly change their behavior. They grow more slowly. They stop branching out. They become more conservative. And over time, that limited root activity begins to affect the entire plant. From my experience, this is where many gardeners miss the real issue, because we're trained to look at leaves, color, shape, surface damage. But by the time something shows up there, the roots have often been struggling for a while. And sometimes, the signs are so subtle that we don't connect them back to the roots at all. A plant that drinks less water than expected. A plant that doesn't respond much after feeding. A plant that just stays the same. These aren't dramatic symptoms, but they are signals, just quieter ones. In many home gardens, root stress doesn't come from one big problem. It comes from small, repeated conditions that limit how roots behave. Soil staying a bit too wet, airflow in the soil being a bit too low, space for roots being a bit too tight. None of these stop the plant completely, but together they slow it down. And when roots are limited, the plant above has no choice but to follow. Growth becomes smaller, slower, less consistent. So even though we can't see the roots directly, learning to think about what they're experiencing can change how we understand everything happening above the soil. Watering is one of those things in gardening that feels simple until you look a little closer. Because most of the time, the issue isn't whether you're watering, it's how often and how the soil responds over time. From my experience, many plants that seem stuck are actually reacting to a watering pattern that never quite gives them what they need. Not too dry, not too wet, but never quite right for long enough. For example, watering a little too frequently can keep the soil in a constant state of moisture. It doesn't look soaked, it doesn't seem excessive, but it also never fully dries out. And when that happens, roots don't get the signal to grow deeper. They stay closer to the surface. They become more cautious. And over time, that limits how much the plant can expand. On the other hand, waiting too long between watering can create a different kind of stress. The plant slows down to conserve energy, and even when water returns, it takes time to recover its rhythm. So it's not just about giving water, it's about creating a cycle, a rhythm the plant can rely on. In many home gardens, plants grow best when the soil has time to hold water, use that water, and then gradually release it. That cycle gives roots a reason to explore, to stretch deeper, to become more resilient. But when watering is too frequent or too inconsistent, that cycle gets interrupted. And without that rhythm, growth becomes uneven or slows down altogether. This is why two gardeners can use the same amount of water but see very different results, because timing matters just as much as quantity. So sometimes, improving growth isn't about adding more water, It's about adjusting the space between each time you reach for the watering can. Light is one of those factors in gardening that can be easy to underestimate, because as long as a plant is still green, we tend to assume it's getting enough. But in many cases, the light is just enough to keep the plant alive, not enough to help it truly grow. From my experience, this is one of the most common reasons plants stay in that in-between state. They're not struggling in an obvious way, but they're also not moving forward. Leaves stay green, the plant holds its shape, but new growth becomes slower, smaller, and less consistent. Because light doesn't just help a plant survive, it fuels the energy needed for growth. And when that energy is limited, the plant becomes more conservative. It prioritizes maintaining what it already has, instead of creating something new. This often happens in places where light feels bright enough to us, near a window, in partial shade, under filtered sunlight. But for the plant, that light may not reach the level needed for active growth. And just like with water or soil, this is rarely an extreme problem. It's usually a small difference, a little less light than needed, a shorter duration than ideal, a slightly obstructed angle. But over time, those small differences add up, and the plant adapts by slowing down. One of the subtle signs of this is when a plant stays alive for a long time, but doesn't seem to change. No new leaves for weeks, or new leaves that are smaller than the previous ones. That's often not a failure, it's a signal, a quiet indication that the plant is working with limited energy. So sometimes, improving growth isn't about adding more care. It's about adjusting where the plant receives its light and giving it just a little more than enough to survive. At first, adjusting your plants can feel like the right thing to do. You move them a little closer to the light. You turn the pot slightly. You change their position to help them grow better. And sometimes, those changes do help. But when adjustments happen too often, they can create a different kind of problem. Plants don't just respond to conditions. They also respond to consistency. They adapt to where they are, to how light falls across their leaves, to how moisture moves through the soil. And that adaptation takes time, not hours, not even just a day or two, but longer, in a way that isn't always visible right away. So when a plant is moved, even slightly, it begins adjusting again. And if that keeps happening, the plant never quite settles into a stable rhythm. From my experience, this is one of those patterns that feels helpful, but quietly slows things down. Because instead of growing forward, the plant keeps resetting, rebalancing, readapting, readjusting. And all of that uses energy. Energy that could have gone into new leaves, new roots, new growth. In many home gardens, the difference between a plant that grows and one that stays stuck isn't always about doing more. It's about changing less, giving the plant a stable place, letting it experience the same conditions long enough to respond in a meaningful way. This doesn't mean never adjusting. It just means adjusting with intention, and then allowing time for the plant to respond. Because growth doesn't happen in constant change. It happens when the plant has something steady to grow into. So sometimes the most helpful thing you can do is stop adjusting and let the plant catch up. When a plant is struggling in obvious ways, it's usually easier to respond. Leaves turn yellow. Growth stops completely. Something clearly looks wrong. But when a plant is stuck, the signs are much quieter. And that's what makes them easy to miss. From my experience, these signs often show up slowly and in ways that don't feel urgent, which is why they're often overlooked. One of the first things to notice is the lack of new growth, not just for a few days, but for weeks. You keep checking, but nothing new appears. No new leaves, no new shoots, just the same structure staying the same. Another subtle sign is when new growth does appear, but it's smaller than expected. Leaves that don't quite reach their usual size, stems that seem thinner, growth that feels incomplete. You might also notice that the plant uses less water over time. The soil stays moist longer than before, and you find yourself watering less without really planning to. That's often not because the plant needs less care, it's because it's doing less, using less energy, taking in less water. Another quiet signal is how the plant responds to feeding. You add nutrients, but nothing really changes. No visible boost, no noticeable shift. And perhaps the most subtle sign of all is the feeling that time is passing, but the plant isn't. Weeks go by. The garden changes around it, but that one plant stays exactly where it was. None of these signs are dramatic, but when they show up together, they tell a very clear story. The plant isn't failing, it's just not moving forward. And once you learn to notice these quiet signals, you can respond earlier and more gently. When something doesn't seem right in the garden, our first instinct is usually to fix it, and quickly. We adjust the watering, we move the plant, we change the soil, we add something new, hoping it will help. And sometimes that instinct comes from a good place. We care. We want to respond before things get worse. But in many cases, reacting too quickly can make things harder to understand. Because plants don't respond instantly. They don't show results overnight. They don't adjust in a straight, predictable way. There's always a delay between what you do and how the plant responds. So when multiple changes happen too close together, it becomes difficult to see what actually made a difference. Was it the watering, the new position, the soil change, or none of them? From my experience, this is where confusion starts to build. Because instead of learning from each adjustment, we begin layering changes on top of each other. And over time, that creates a kind of noise in the process. Too many inputs, too many variables, not enough clarity. The plant, in the meantime, is still trying to adjust, still trying to find balance in an environment that keeps shifting. And just like we saw earlier, that constant adjustment can slow growth even further. This is why patience isn't just about waiting, it's about giving each change enough time to show its effect. Instead of reacting immediately, it can be more helpful to pause, make one small adjustment, then observe. Not for a few hours, but for days, sometimes longer. Because clarity in gardening doesn't come from doing more things. It comes from understanding what each thing actually does. And that understanding takes time. So sometimes the best response is not the fastest one. It's the most patient one. At some point in gardening, you begin to realize that not every situation needs an immediate response. Sometimes what's needed first is simply to observe. Not quickly, not casually, but with a bit more patience and a bit more attention. From my experience, this is where gardening starts to feel less reactive and more intentional. Because instead of asking, "What should I do next?" you begin to ask, "What is the plant actually telling me?" And that shift changes everything. You start noticing patterns, how the soil feels, not just today, but over several days. How the light moves across the plant from morning to afternoon. How the plant responds, not immediately, but over time. Observation isn't about doing nothing. It's about understanding before doing something. For example, instead of watering right away, you might check how long the soil has been holding moisture. Instead of moving the plant, you might watch how the light changes during the day. Instead of adding fertilizer, you might ask whether the plant is in a condition to use it. These are small pauses, but they create space for clearer decisions. And over time, those clearer decisions lead to more stable growth. Not because you're doing more, but because you're doing what matters at the right moment. In many home gardens, the difference between confusion and confidence isn't knowledge alone, it's observation. learning to slow down just enough to see what's already there. So before you reach for the watering can or adjust the plant again, take a moment. Look a little closer. Because often the plant is already giving you the answer. After everything we've talked about, it might feel like the safest thing to do is nothing at all. And sometimes that's true. But there are moments when a small, thoughtful adjustment can make a real difference. The key is not doing more, it's doing less, but doing it more precisely. From my experience, the most helpful changes are often the smallest ones. A slight shift in position to improve the quality of light. Not a big move, just enough to change how the plant receives energy. Or adjusting how you water, not necessarily giving more or less, but giving it at a more consistent interval, letting the soil complete its natural cycle before stepping in again. Sometimes it's the soil itself, not replacing everything, but loosening the surface slightly, or improving drainage just enough to allow more air into the root zone. These changes don't look dramatic, they don't feel like a full fix, but they create better conditions for the plant to respond. And when the conditions are right, plants usually don't need to be pushed. They begin to move forward on their own. A new leaf appears. Growth becomes a little more consistent, not all at once, but gradually. This is where patience and adjustment come together. You observe first, you make one small change, and then you give it time. If the plant responds, you continue in that direction. If it doesn't, you adjust again, gently. Because in gardening, progress often comes from a series of small corrections, not one big solution. There's a moment in gardening that can feel a little uncomfortable, when you've noticed something isn't quite right, but instead of acting, you choose to wait. And that can feel like you're not doing enough, like you're missing a chance to help. But from my experience, this is often where some of the best progress begins. Not in action, but in restraint. Because once you've made a thoughtful adjustment, the most important thing you can do next is give the plant time to respond. Not hours, not overnight, but days, sometimes longer. During that time, a lot is happening beneath the surface. Roots are adjusting to new moisture levels. They're exploring small pockets of soil. They're slowly rebuilding their rhythm. And none of that is visible right away, which is why it can feel like nothing is happening. But nothing on the surface doesn't mean nothing is happening. It often means the plant is working quietly in the right direction. This is where doing nothing is not neglect. It's support. It's allowing the plant to use the conditions you've already created, instead of interrupting that process with another change. In many home gardens, growth doesn't come from constant input. It comes from giving the plant space to follow through. And that space is something we often forget to offer because it doesn't feel active, it doesn't feel productive, but it is. This is something I had to learn slowly, that sometimes the best way to help a plant grow is to step back and trust the process you've already started. Not forever, but long enough for the plant to meet you halfway. So if you've made a careful adjustment and you're not sure what to do next, you may already be doing it by giving it time. One of the most challenging parts of gardening is learning to trust a timeline you can't fully see. Because growth doesn't always happen in ways that are immediate or obvious. We often expect progress to look clear, a new leaf, a visible change, something we can point to and say, yes, it's working. But in many cases, real progress begins long before that. It starts below the surface, in the roots as they slowly expand, in the soil as it settles into a better balance, in the plant itself as it shifts from holding on to preparing for growth. And all of that takes time, more time than we often expect. From my experience, this is where patience becomes more than just waiting. It becomes understanding. Understanding that what you don't see can still be moving in the right direction. Because plants don't grow on our schedule. They respond to conditions and they move at their own pace. Sometimes that pace feels slow, especially when you're paying attention every day. But that doesn't mean nothing is happening. It often means the plant is building a stronger foundation first. And once that foundation is ready, growth above the surface begins to follow. A new leaf appears, then another. And slowly, what once felt stuck starts to feel alive again. Not because something suddenly changed, but because the process was already underway. So when you're caring for a plant that doesn't seem to be moving, it may not be behind. It may just be on a timeline you haven't seen yet. If there's one idea to take away from all of this, it's that not all problems in the garden are loud. Some of them are quiet. They don't show up as damage. They don't demand immediate attention, but they still shape how your plants grow or don't grow. From my experience, these in-between moments are where the most learning happens. Not when things go wrong, but when things simply stop moving forward. Because that's where you begin to notice patterns. How small conditions add up. How timing matters. How consistency often matters more than effort. And over time, you start to trust a different approach. Less reacting, more observing. Less adjusting, more understanding. You begin to see that growth is not something you force, it's something you support. And when the conditions are right, even quietly, plants tend to find their way forward. Not all at once, but steadily. If this way of looking at gardening feels helpful to you, you're always welcome to stay and explore more with us. We take things slowly here, and we try to understand before we act. And if you've experienced something similar in your own garden, feel free to share it. Because often, those quiet experiences are the ones that teach us the most. Thanks for spending this time in the garden with me.